Avoidants rarely cross this invisible boundary with an empath unless their feelings are truly real. Imagine discovering that the strongest sign of love isn't hearing "I love you," receiving constant messages, or experiencing grand romantic gestures. For some people, love is shown when they willingly step beyond a boundary they've spent years protecting, a place so private and carefully guarded that very few people are ever allowed inside. If you've ever cared about an avoidant, you've probably asked yourself the same painful question: do they really love me, or am I just another person standing outside the emotional walls they never seem to lower? The truth is more complicated than most people think. Avoidants don't measure love the way many others do. They rarely express their deepest emotions through dramatic conversations or endless reassurance. Instead, those feelings are often hidden beneath silence, distance, and self-protection. There is one boundary they almost never cross unless their feelings are genuine. Once you understand what that boundary is, many of their confusing behaviors begin to make sense. Stay with me until the end, because this insight may completely change the way you see avoidant attachment, relationships, and love. And if you enjoy learning about the hidden psychology of avoidance, subscribe to the Avoidant Guide. Sometimes one insight can explain years of confusion. To understand this boundary, you first have to understand the avoidant mindset. Many people believe avoidants create distance because they don't care. In reality, many create distance because caring feels dangerous. Long before a relationship begins, they've often learned that depending on others can lead to disappointment, emotional pain, or losing the security they've built for themselves. Whether those beliefs came from childhood, inconsistent relationships, or painful experiences, they become experts at protecting their independence. Their emotional world becomes a safe place where they stay in control and avoid unexpected hurt. That's why avoidants often seem comfortable handling everything alone. They value independence, dislike asking for help, and convince themselves they don't need the closeness others naturally seek. From the outside, this can look like confidence. Sometimes it is. But beneath that independence is often a quiet fear that getting too close to someone could threaten the safety they've spent years creating. Because of this, every relationship creates an internal battle. One part of them wants connection, while another fears what that connection might eventually cost. This conflict lies at the center of many avoidant relationships. This is where empaths often enter the picture. Although they seem completely different, avoidants and empaths often feel a powerful attraction. Empaths naturally move toward emotions, while avoidants instinctively step back. Empaths seek closeness and understanding. Avoidants appear guarded and difficult to fully know, yet avoidants are often drawn to the warmth, patience, and acceptance empaths provide. They experience something they secretly crave but rarely ask for: emotional safety. At the same time, empaths sense hidden depth beneath the avoidance walls, making them want to understand them even more. As the relationship grows, so does the tension. The empath hopes for greater openness, while the avoidant wants closeness, but fears losing control. Eventually, every avoidant reaches a point where they must decide whether the relationship is worth the emotional risk. Many people don't realize avoidants are often more afraid of emotional dependence than rejection. Rejection hurts, but needing someone can feel even more threatening. They may think about someone constantly, care deeply, and quietly value them more than anyone realizes. But once they notice they're becoming emotionally attached, alarms go off inside them. Suddenly, they need space. They become harder to read. Their replies slow down. They seem emotionally distant, even as their feelings quietly grow stronger. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment. Many people assume withdrawal means fading interest, when it can actually mean the opposite. The deeper their feelings become, the more vulnerable they feel. The more vulnerable they feel, the stronger their instinct to protect themselves becomes. Love begins competing with fear. One side wants closeness, the other wants safety. Behind it all stands the invisible wall every avoidant carries. It's usually not built from selfishness or coldness, but from years of emotional protection. It separates the parts of themselves they're comfortable sharing from the parts almost nobody ever sees. Most people never move beyond the outside of that wall. They may receive affection and companionship, but they never truly enter the avoidant's inner world. That's why enjoying someone's company and fully trusting them are completely different experiences. An avoidant can genuinely care while still protecting strict emotional boundaries. But sometimes someone slowly changes everything, someone who consistently feels safe, someone who never forces vulnerability, but patiently earns it, someone whose presence begins affecting them in ways they never expected. When that happens, the wall doesn't collapse overnight. Small cracks begin to appear, often so gradually that even the avoidant doesn't notice. Without realizing it, they begin approaching the one boundary they promised themselves they would never cross. Then something predictable happens. As the empath gets closer, the avoidant often pulls away. Conversations become shorter, replies become slower, distance returns just when the relationship seemed strongest. For the empath, this feels heartbreaking. But beneath the surface, the avoidant usually isn't running from the person. They're running from what the relationship is awakening inside them. The closer someone gets, the harder it becomes to deny their emotional investment. The possibility of losing that person becomes real. Even more frightening, the possibility of actually needing them becomes real. For someone who has always believed independence is the safest path, that's overwhelming. So they create distance, not because the relationship means too little, but because it suddenly means far more than they expected. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of avoidant psychology. Their retreat is often a reaction to growing emotional significance rather than fading interest. Eventually, however, a defining moment arrives. This is the invisible line mentioned from the beginning, the boundary avoidants almost never cross unless their love is genuine. It happens when they begin allowing another person's presence to influence the decisions they make. For most people, that's simply part of a healthy relationship. But for an avoidant, it's a profound psychological shift. It means someone has become important enough to enter the private emotional space they've protected for years. And that level of trust is something they almost never offer unless they truly love you. Remember, independence isn't simply a preference for an avoidant. It's part of the emotional system they've built to protect themselves. Most of their choices are based on their own needs, goals, and sense of safety. Freedom gives them control, and control makes them feel secure. But when their love becomes genuine, something slowly begins to change. They start asking questions they rarely considered before. How will this affect the person I care about? What can I do to make them feel safe? What's best for our relationship instead of just what's easiest for me? To most people, those questions seem completely normal. For an avoidant, they're a major emotional breakthrough. They show that the person is no longer living as though they only have themselves to think about. Someone else's happiness starts to matter. Someone else's pain becomes difficult to ignore. Their relationship begins carrying as much importance as their own comfort. This change isn't forced, and it doesn't happen because they feel guilty or obligated. It happens because someone has become emotionally important enough to break through walls that once seemed impossible to reach. What's even more meaningful is that this transformation usually appears in small moments before it ever appears in big ones. An avoidant who truly loves someone won't suddenly become highly emotional overnight. They probably won't give long speeches about their feelings or reveal every hidden thought at once. Instead, love quietly shows itself through changes in behavior. They begin adjusting their plans to include another person. They remember little details that matter. They pay closer attention to emotional reactions. They start caring about situations that once wouldn't have affected them. For perhaps the first time in years, another person's emotional experience begins influencing the decisions they make. This is the boundary avoidants rarely cross because it requires a level of vulnerability that goes far beyond words. It means accepting that someone has become important enough to influence how they live their life. For someone who has spent years protecting their independence, that's an enormous step. It's one of the clearest signs that their feelings have moved beyond attraction, comfort, or convenience. It's genuine emotional investment. This distinction becomes even clearer when we separate attachment from real love. Many people believe strong attachment automatically means love, but they aren't always the same thing. An avoidant can become attached while still keeping their deepest emotions protected. They can enjoy someone's company, appreciate the routine of the relationship, and value that person's presence without fully lowering their emotional defenses. Attachment can exist while the protective walls remain standing. Love asks for something much greater. Love requires trust. It requires emotional risk. It requires allowing another person's well-being to matter enough that it changes your own behavior. When an avoidant starts making decisions that protect the relationship instead of only protecting themselves, when they begin considering another person's emotional reality alongside their own, attachment starts growing into something much deeper. That's why some avoidants remain in relationships for years without ever crossing that invisible line. They may genuinely care, they may value the relationship, but real love begins when self-protection no longer controls every decision. It begins when connection becomes worth the emotional risk. One of the most beautiful parts of this journey is that the signs usually appear long before the avoidant ever says anything about them. You begin noticing quiet but meaningful changes. They disappear less often. Their emotional walls don't feel quite as high. They no longer rush to create distance whenever intimacy grows. Conversations begin reaching places that once felt completely off limits. Instead of immediately shutting down when emotions become uncomfortable, they stay present a little longer. They listen more carefully. They share more openly. They allow themselves to be seen in ways that once felt impossible. To someone watching from the outside, these changes may seem small, but for an avoidant, they're enormous victories. Every moment of consistency challenges an old fear. Every act of openness weakens years of emotional protection. Every decision to choose connection over distance is another step toward healing. That's why understanding avoidance requires looking beyond obvious behaviors. Their deepest expressions of love are often quiet. They appear through consistency, trust, emotional presence, and the willingness to stay engaged even when every instinct tells them to pull away. As those walls continue to soften, another remarkable change begins to happen. The avoidant slowly opens the door to the one place they've protected their entire life, their inner world. Once that door starts opening, everything changes. When an avoidant begins sharing their inner world, the relationship reaches a place very few people ever experience. Most avoidants carefully control how much of themselves other people can see. They may talk about everyday experiences, opinions, humor, or parts of their past, but the deepest layers usually remain hidden. These are the fears they rarely admit, the disappointments they still carry, the experiences that shaped how they view love and relationships, the vulnerabilities they've kept locked away for years. They don't hide these things because they enjoy secrecy. They hide them because somewhere in their life they learned that vulnerability could lead to pain, rejection, disappointment, judgment, or losing control. So when they begin revealing those hidden parts, they aren't simply sharing stories. They're taking an emotional risk. They're allowing someone to see pieces of themselves that can never truly be hidden again. That's why an avoidant opening up almost never happens all at once. It usually unfolds slowly. A conversation becomes unexpectedly deeper. A memory they've never shared suddenly slips out. A personal fear they intended to keep private finally gets spoken aloud. To an empath, these moments may seem ordinary. To the avoidant, they can feel life-changing. Every confession carries the quiet fear of what the other person will do with that trust. When they continue opening up despite that fear, it sends a powerful message. It means the relationship has become more valuable than the safety of staying emotionally hidden. Ironically, this is where many empaths unintentionally miss what's happening. Because empaths often measure love through emotional intensity and clear verbal expression, they sometimes overlook these quieter changes. They hope for dramatic declarations, obvious vulnerability, or constant reassurance. When those things don't happen quickly, they assume little has changed. Meanwhile, the avoidant may be making the biggest emotional progress of their life. The person who once disappeared during difficult conversations now stays. The person who once kept every struggle private now shares pieces of their inner experience. The person who once protected distance above everything else is slowly allowing real closeness. These changes may not look dramatic, but they are deeply meaningful. This often creates one of the most painful misunderstandings between avoidants and empaths. The empath feels unseen because they're waiting for bigger expressions of love. The avoidant feels unseen because their quiet efforts go unnoticed. The truth is that avoidants usually communicate love through changed behavior more than spoken words. Their feelings become visible through consistency, trust, emotional presence, and the willingness to remain connected when every instinct tells them to leave. As the relationship continues growing, one final shift begins to appear. The avoidant starts making sacrifices they once refused to make, not by losing themselves or changing their personality, but by relaxing the protective habits that once controlled every decision. For years, emotional safety came first, distance came first, independence came first. But real love slowly rearranges those priorities. They begin accepting discomfort for the sake of the relationship. They have conversations they'd normally avoid. They stay emotionally available during difficult moments. And instead of walking away from conflict, they begin choosing to work through it together. These sacrifices may look small from the outside, but for an avoidant, they represent a huge internal shift. Every compromise challenges the belief that vulnerability must always be avoided. Every choice to stay connected during difficult moments slowly weakens years of emotional defenses. Real love rarely changes an avoidant through dramatic gestures. Instead, the transformation happens quietly, one decision at a time. Again and again, they choose connection even when protecting themselves would feel easier. One of the clearest signs of this change is when they stop planning only for themselves. Most avoidants are used to building their lives around independence. Their routines, goals, and future plans revolve around personal freedom because freedom feels safe. But when someone becomes deeply important, that mindset slowly changes. Without realizing it, they begin including another person in their future. Their decisions naturally take the relationship into account. They picture shared experiences instead of thinking only about themselves. This shift is significant because planning a future requires trust. It means believing someone deserves a place in their long-term life. The more important that person becomes, the more vulnerable losing them would feel. Slowly, my future becomes our future, even if those words are never spoken. Another misunderstanding about avoidance is how they express love. Their deepest devotion is often hidden in ordinary moments. They show up when it matters. They remember small details. They become reliable. They quietly solve problems. They create stability through consistent actions rather than dramatic words. For an avoidant, reliability is commitment. Consistency is love in action. That's why their feelings are better understood through repeated behavior than emotional promises. Over time, those quiet actions reveal a bigger picture. The avoidant who once protected themselves from closeness begins choosing closeness despite their fears. Even then, an internal battle continues. Many people assume love removes an avoidant's fears, but it often makes them stronger. One part of them longs for connection, trust, and emotional security. Another remembers past disappointments and tries to protect them from getting hurt again. That's why they sometimes move closer, then pull away. They open up, then become quiet. To others, this feels confusing. Inside, they're balancing two powerful needs: the desire for love and the need for safety. This is also why empaths often become so important to avoidants, not because they're perfect, but because they create something rare: emotional safety. They offer acceptance without pressure. They give space without abandoning the relationship. They remain patient while respecting themselves. Most importantly, they make the avoidant feel understood instead of judged. Many avoidants spend years feeling misunderstood. Their silence is mistaken for indifference. Their distance is seen as rejection. Their hesitation is confused with a lack of love. But when someone sees beyond those defenses, something remarkable happens. The avoidant begins feeling emotionally safe. They experience a relationship where they don't have to be perfect to be accepted. Instead of expecting criticism, they experience understanding. Instead of anticipating danger, they begin trusting the connection. Eventually, a turning point arrives. The relationship becomes something they can no longer imagine losing. Their partner's happiness matters. Their pain matters. Their absence would matter. For the first time, someone else's presence becomes part of what makes life meaningful. That realization is both beautiful and frightening because now there's something real to lose. When they finally accept those feelings, their behavior changes in quiet but unmistakable ways. They become more intentional, more dependable, more emotionally present, and more invested, not because fear disappears, but because the relationship becomes more important than the fear. This is the clearest sign an avoidant truly loves an empath. It isn't constant texting. It isn't grand romance. It isn't perfect communication. It's their willingness to cross the lifelong boundary of emotional self-protection. They allow another person's feelings to affect them. They allow someone else's needs to influence their decisions. They accept that loving deeply always involves risk. For an avoidant, this is one of the greatest acts of trust they can offer. Love isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing connection despite fear, choosing intimacy despite uncertainty, choosing another person even when every instinct says it's safer to stay guarded. Real love doesn't always look dramatic. For avoidance, it's often quiet. It's found in consistency instead of intensity, presence instead of performance, and slowly earned trust instead of instant vulnerability. The invisible line was never about one specific behavior. It was about allowing another person to become more important than self-protection. That's when genuine love appears. Not because they stop valuing independence, but because they discover something they value even more: connection, trust, and the courage to let someone into the parts of themselves they once believed would always remain closed. When an avoidant finally crosses that line, they aren't simply opening their heart. They're rewriting the emotional rules they've lived by for years. For someone who has spent a lifetime protecting themselves, there may be no greater proof of love than that.